So thank you very much for joining us. And now I want to introduce our facilitator, Aaliyah. Aaliyah, thank you so very much for joining us today. Aaliyah grew up in northeastern New Jersey and had a love for gardening and the outdoors since childhood. This love was one of the things that spurred her to attend Cornell University, where she was first introduced to her current passion, weed science. Aaliyah is currently a weed science extension aide in the GreenThumb lab at Cornell. So I'm going to remove myself from the spotlight and turn it over to Aaliyah, and thank you again.
Wonderful. Okay, can everyone hear me? Wonderful. I'm going to share my screen real quick, share, and let's start this presentation. Everyone can see the presentation slides and not my notes. Wunderbar, very happy about that. So like Vanessa said, my name is Aleah Butler-Jones. I work in the GreenThumb lab as a lab manager, but the part of my job that is more relevant today is my work as a weed science extension aide. And I'm super excited to be with you today. I wish it would be in person and we could get our hands dirty touching and smelling and all those things with weeds, but soon that day will come. So before we start, I want to start with a poll. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of basics of weed identification and control options, we're going to start with a poll. And in this poll, you'll have options, and I just want you to reflect your familiarity with this topic. So here it is, polls. So this poll will be open for about a minute. And the question is, how experienced are you with weed identification? Y'all are fast. I appreciate it. So it seems like it's so far about 3/4 of people have answered the poll, and we seem to have a pretty even split between people who have very little familiarity with this topic. What's in there, the only plantains I know of are those for eating, versus people who have some familiarity with the topic, with some of the terminology, but they want their knowledge to grow. So give it another, let's say 30 seconds for people to fill in, but yeah. Okay, well, I'm gonna close out the poll. Oh, we got one advanced person, someone who could probably do this for me. So just showing the results, you can see that about even split between beginners and intermediates and one advanced person. And let's go from here. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about first, what is a weed? What counts as a weed? Then we'll go through some weed ID basics, so some botanical terminology that you should be aware of and at least somewhat familiar with, for you to not only be able to identify weeds, but also utilize plant keys and weed guides. Then we're going, from there, we're going to do a walkthrough, an exercise of identifying 3 weeds. There will be 2 broadleafs. And if you're not familiar with the term broadleaf, I will explain later, in 1 grass weed. And I'll show you how I would go about, if I was not familiar with these plants, how I'd go about identifying these weeds using the Cornell Turfgrass and Landscape Weed ID tool. Finally, the last part, we're going to go talk about some control options, specifically control options that are well suited to community gardens, urban farms, things of such. These are pretty universal themes that, whether you have 1/8 of an acre to 500 acres, these are relevant to crop producers. And then finally, a brief recap. So before we get into weed identification or control, I want us to think about what is a weed. And I know this might seem sort of odd of like, well, Aaliyah, this is a simple question. Everyone knows what a weed is. Everyone's in agreement about what a weed is. So, but just keep an open mind. And to help us do that, let's play a quick game called Weed or Nah. In this, I will describe a scenario and you will answer, yes, this is a weed. No, it is not a weed. And I'm not sure. And please answer with your honest opinion. So let's start with the first scenario. Weed or nah? Plants growing in this garden walkway. If you can see my cursor, these plants here, you see some broadleaf plantain, some clover. Are these weeds or nah? So I will open up the next poll and let's give it about 2 minutes. Well, you guys are very quick with your bounces. Already 3/4 of the people. And no, there's no judgments about whatever answer you give. Give this about, let's give it about another 30 seconds. If you don't want to participate, that's fine as well. Just to get some final opinions regarding, are these plants in the walkway of this garden, are they weeds or not? Okay. I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds. Okay. So, can everyone see the poll results? Yes? Wonderful. Okay, so you see there's more of a split than I expected, which that's fun, that's interesting. See, about 43% of the participants today said, yes, these are weeds. About 38%, almost an equal amount, said, no, they're not weeds. And then 20% of people said, I'm not sure, are they weeds or not? Either way. And I want you to think about in your mind, if based on how you voted, think about why did you vote that way, and then think about why did another person vote that way, and some of the things that might have influenced their vote as we go through these different questions. So next, weed or not, a dandelion growing between pavers. Let's say this is on someone who has a patio, and these are the pavers in the backyard of the patio or in a park patio or whatever, and you see this dandelion growing between the paver. Is it a weed or not? So we're going to start the poll, and again, we'll give it about 2 minutes. Seems like the chat is quite alive in terms of debate about whether or not they're weeds and what constitutes a weed. It's great to see such a lively debate. There might not be as much lively debate in when I was an undergrad, because we're in an upstate region. So we're going to leave it open for about another 30 seconds. So get your final votes in there. Okay, closing in about 10 seconds. Okay. So again, you see a pretty stark split in the audience between yes, the majority of people said yes. It's not a plurality, and quite a few people said either no or I'm not sure if it's a weed. So next question. There we go. So what about this? Alone, these corn plants in a soybean field. And before you answer, I want you to think, this year, this field is planted in soybean, but the previous year, this field was planted in corn. So are these corn plants weeds or not? And again, we're going to open up the poll for about 2 minutes. There we go. Okay, so I see about 86% of the audience has voted. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds in the interest of time. Again, is this corn plant a weed in this field of soybeans? Okay, going to close out the poll. And again, you see a pretty, most people said yes, but there's more I don't knows with this, and that's an important part. Next, let me go here. Weedy area or not? The area around this beehive. Let's say this is in, this is in a field or something of the such. So I'm going to open up the poll. I see about 80% of people have voted already, so let's give it another 30 seconds. Get your last thoughts into the poll. Okay, 10 more seconds. Final thoughts. Okay. So you see the vast majority of people say, no, these are not weeds. This area around this beehive is not a weedy area. So just think about why. Again, let's keep on thinking about why. And then we have the final question of weeds or not, which I hope you've enjoyed this game a little bit, is the flowers in this lawn. Let's say it's a residential lawn. Are these flowers, you see there's some dandelion in there and some other flowers, are they weeds or not? And let's give it about a minute since you guys are so fast with your mouses or mice. Yeah, there we go. Okay, let's give it 30 more seconds. So the last 16% of people, if they want to participate, can. Okay, I'm closing the poll in 10 seconds. Okay. So again, you see like the area surrounding that beehive, the majority of people, not as many people think, but the majority of people think that these plants, these flowers in this lawn are not weeds. So I see the chat has lit up with people justifying their decisions of whether or not this is a weed, this is not a weed. And this gets to the idea of, okay, well, Aaliyah, you've asked us all these questions, are these weeds or not? And you haven't even told us what is a weed. And my point of having us do that exercise is to show how fluid the designation of a plant as a weed or not a weed can be. The definition of a weed, especially your personal definition of a weed, is very situation dependent. There's no botanical definition of a weed. It's not like a fruit or a tree or any of those things. If you go to a botanical conference and say, give me a definition of a weed, they can't, there's not a definition that everyone's in agreement about. So what I did is I popped it into Google and I put in weed. And then I said, okay, dictionary.com weed to narrow down my results. And I see on the left, a valueless plant growing wild, especially one that grows on cultivated ground to the exclusion or injury of the desired crop. An undesirable or troublesome plant. On the right, definition from Merriam-Webster, a plant that is not valued where it is growing and is usually a vigorous growth, a weedy growth of plants. So, okay, that's great. What does that mean? So to put it simply, a weed is a plant out of place. There's Ralph Waldo Emerson has a quote where it's like a weed is a plant that its virtues are not known yet, yada, blah, blah, blah. But to put it very simply, it's simply a plant out of place. That can be out of place spatially, like on the right here. I hope you guys can see my cursor. You see this lawn and there's a walkway, and assuming this grass is of the same species or mix of turf, just because it's a few inches outside of the lawn, someone would probably consider that a weed. It could also be out of place in time, like we saw with that cornfield example in one of the poll questions of, well, the previous year, let's say 2019, they planted that field full of corn. That corn, an individual corn plant is not a weed, it is the desired plant. The next year in 2020, let's say they planted that field with soybean and they have a few corn that still pops up. Many people would consider that a weed, specifically a volunteer weed. So moving on, now that we have an idea of what is a weed, which you might be wondering, wow, we spent a lot of time just talking about what is the thing that we will be discussing today. Let's get into weed identification. So weed identification is the process of identifying weeds. And you might wonder, okay, great. Why should I bother with identifying the weeds in my garden or my lawn or anything like that? And the love of it is probably it might be a good enough answer for some people, but for others who are a little bit more practically inclined, perhaps not. So there's several reasons why weed identification is very important. One, as Sun Tzu said, know thy enemy. It is helpful to know, not to say weeds are enemies, but it's helpful to know what you're dealing with. By understanding the plants that you're trying to either keep or get rid of, and understanding the weed's biology, such as its life cycle, its means of reproduction, it allows for a more appropriate selection of control methods. So that can include when you're going to apply this control method, so optimal timing. That can include knowing, does this plant have vegetative structures? So do I need to, how will that change how I remove this plant? And then finally, it can have an impact on your decision in terms of the impact of this weed. Maybe you go in a schoolyard and you wonder, okay, what is this? I see this, and you identify it as poison ivy. That's something that you would probably want to remove from areas that children play in, or wild parsnip, another example that can cause photodermatitis. Or on the flip side, you might see a plant that you did not intend to be there in your garden, but upon identifying it, you find that it's both a native and a pollinator attracted, and that changes your decision from pulling the weed to letting it grow and attract bees and other pollinators. Without knowing what that weed is, you can't make as informed decisions. So moving on from there, we're going to get into some botanical terminology basics, and it's biology all over again. So to start with botanical terminology that is necessary to know, especially if you're doing any type of plant ID, we're going to start with life forms. So on the left, if you can see my mouse, my cursor, on the left, you have a general diagram of a monocot. On the right, you have a general diagram of a dicot, also called a broadleaf plant. You might see BLW, that's someone saying broadleaf weed. So monocots are flowering plants, also called angiosperms, characterized by a seedling with one cotyledon. Now let's back up a little bit. What's a cotyledon? A cotyledon, as you can see, it's right here and here. These are cotyledons. It's an embryonic leaf in seed-bearing plants where there's at least one or more of them, and within them are the first true leaves of a germinating seed. So monocot, mono meaning one, di meaning two. Monocots have one cotyledon, dicots have two. So monocots, they have one cotyledon, like I said. Their leaves tend to have parallel veins. So think corn, grasses, all of those are monocots, and those veins are straight up and down rather than branching out. Their flowers grow in their flower parts tend to be in multiples of threes, and they lack secondary growth. As opposed to dicots, also called broadleafs again, they're a flowering plant characterized by seedlings with two cotyledon leaves with branching veins and flower parts in multiples of fours and fives, and they often have secondary growth. So think a tree that is like an oak tree, secondary growth, that is secondary growth. So moving on from there, we're going to talk briefly about life cycles. This is something that you're probably somewhat familiar with if you've ever planted vegetables or anything and you look at the seed pack and they'll say, oh, this is an annual plant, oh, this is a biennial plant, oh, this is a perennial. It's also very relevant to weeds. So starting off, we're going to talk about annuals. So in these pictures, these are all different types of annuals. And an annual is a plant that completes its life cycle in 1 year or less. And they're generally separated into two groups: the summer annuals on the left-hand side of the screen and winter annuals. So summer annuals are plants that complete its life cycle in one growing season. It tends to go from seed to seed production and death in 6 months or less. Versus winter annuals, they typically survive 6 to 9 months or a year, and they germinate in the fall, survive in the fall and winter, typically as a rosette, and I'll explain later what a rosette is, and then they'll shed seed or set seed, another word for that, in the early summer, and then it dies. So note that summer annuals are typically found in spring seeded crops, whereas winter annuals are typically found in fall seeded crops. And it is helpful to understand that a weed is an annual because they will not live multiple seasons, at least the same organism, and it can impact your management decisions. So some common examples of annuals are all the way on the left. This is large crabgrass. In the middle, you might have seen this. This is lamb's quarters, Chenopodium album. And furthest on the right, this is, I believe, Powell amaranth, which is a pigweed. It's pigweeds in gardens. A lot of times what you see are these two pigweeds, some type of pigweed in lamb's quarters. As opposed to on the right, this is shepherd's purse, it's a winter annual. And then on the furthest right, this is mousehair chickweed. Both of these are winter annuals. Chickweeds, you tend to see them, they're clumped on the ground. Moving on, we're going to talk about biennials. So a biennial is a plant that requires 2 years to complete its life cycle. Now, with that said, you should know that some biennials are known to live for more than 2 years as vegetative rosettes. So the thing that is a terminating feature, or the event that kills biennials, is seed production. So if they don't produce seed, they can continue living in their vegetative state. So in the first season, the seed germinates and only produces vegetative structures. So on the right, this is bull thistle, and it's in its first growing season. And then the following growing season, after a vernalization period, which is a cold period that is required to induce flowering, the plant flowers, as you can see on the left. That's a inflorescence. I'll explain if you're not familiar with that term later. Of wild carrot, Docus carota. And then once it sets seed, it dies. And again, it's important to know what's a biennial versus what's a perennial, especially because it can affect management decisions, which I'll get into a little bit more in the next slide. Now, our final life cycle we're going to speak about today are perennials, specifically herbaceous perennials. I'm not going to cover woody perennials today. It's a perennial is a plant that survives for more than 2 years. It doesn't complete its life cycle in 2 years. And those are generally separated into groups: simple herbaceous perennials, or simple perennials on the left, broadleaf plantain. That was one of the plantains I was referencing earlier in one of the poll questions. And dandelion is another simple perennial. Simple perennials reproduce naturally only from seeds, but they can also reproduce from cut pieces. Generally, they do not normally reproduce vegetatively. That's as opposed to creeping herbaceous perennials, which are also called vegetative perennials, and they can reproduce through seed and also spread through vegetative means. So that can be through tubers, that can be through stolons, that can be through rhizomes. Again, if you're not familiar with these terms, don't worry, we're gonna talk about it a little bit later. And there are plants that weeds specifically that might look similar to each other, but one might be a biennial and one might be a perennial. And that's pretty important to know, especially for management decisions. So a good example of that is bull thistle, like you saw in the previous, this right here, and Canada thistle. Bull thistle grows as a biennial. Canada thistle grows as a vegetative perennial or a creeping herbaceous perennial. If you use the same, if you identify something as bull thistle, but it's actually Canada thistle, and you employ the techniques you would use for bull thistle, you probably will not get rid of your Canada thistle infestation if you so desire, because Canada thistle also spreads by rhizome. So even if you pull up the plant or cut back the plant, it's going to grow as long as you haven't removed all those plant pieces, it's still going to come back until it exhausts its carbohydrate reserves. So from here, we're going to talk about growth habit. So growth habit, all it is generally how does the plant grow? So we have upright, they tend to grow mainly upright as in the name, and they tend to be taller than they are wide. So an example of that is a sunflower. That's an upright growing plant. As opposed to clumping, those are plants that have more of a mound-like habit, and they tend to be as equally wide as they are tall. So a good example of that is yellow nutsedge, which is, it's a sedge, it's a monocot, it's technically not a grass. There's also spreading plants. They tend to grow in a horizontal habit, creating ground clover. So if you've seen white clover or clover, they have trifoliate or 3 leaves. That's a spreading type plant. There's also vining, also called climbing plants. They climb over other plants, and also structures such as fences, as illustrated in this picture, but they may be self-supportive initially. So an example of that is hedge bindweed, field bindweed, poison ivy. And finally, all the way on the right, the rosettes. And they are roughly circular clusters of leaves that remain close to the ground surface. And biennials often exhibit rosette growth habit in their first year. So you see this here. And then in the next year, they grow upright where they produce flowering structures. So like, for example, wild carrot tops. Wild carrot tends to grow in a rosette, and then the following year, after a vernalization period, they'll shoot up a flowering stalk, and you'll have those beautiful flowers. So now we're going to go over some reproductive structures that are pretty useful to know about, especially for vegetative reproduction. So seeds, I'm not going to go over what a seed is, because I have a feeling everyone at this is aware of a seed. But what I will focus on are stolons, rhizomes, and tubers. So a stolon is a horizontal stem that runs above ground and can produce another plant. So in this is a spider plant. If you've ever grown strawberries and you see those runners that go above the ground, those are stolons. Stolons are also called runners. As opposed to rhizomes, which again, they are technically stems, but instead of running over the ground, they go under the ground and they creep underground. An example of that, a plant that has rhizomes is a crabgrass in this picture. These are those rhizomes. So you can pull up the clump of crabgrass, but if you leave these rhizomes behind, crabgrass will probably keep on coming up. Finally, these are tubers, which is a thickened portion, underground portion of a stem. These are some tubers from yellow nutsedge that was shown in a previous picture. They can overwinter. And then not shown in this are bulbs and bulblets. So when a bulb is a short stem composed of fleshy leaves, think an onion. An onion is a bulb. So moving on, inflorescences. I won't go through all of these inflorescences, but first, an inflorescence is a cluster of flowers or a flower head. So if you've ever seen a Queen Anne's lace, that is an inflorescence. And some inflorescence forms that are very common you'll see around are spikes. So if you've ever seen a blade, a head of wheat with wheat berries, and it has that sort of elongated form, that's a spike. Wheat grows in spikes, that's just rye. Versus panicles, they tend to be much more open. I like to think of them as sort of almost looking like fireworks when they explode. An example of a weed that has a panicle inflorescence is witchgrass, Panicum capillare. Panicle is literally in the name. And then umbels, they grow in these clusters of flowers, almost like if you took the way when I first had to learn about umbels, I thought about it as imagine opening an umbrella and then taking the handle off and flipping it upside down. So you see all the spokes and all that, and you have the opening up here. So an example of plants that grow that have umbel inflorescences are wild carrot, pretty much anything in Apiaceae. Apiaceae formerly is also called Umbelliferaceae. I think we can all figure out as to why. From here, I'm going to talk about the specific botanical features to grasses and grass-like plants, so monocots. So over here, you can see a general diagram of a monocot, and here's an example of that inflorescence. This is a panicle type. This region is the collar region. The sheath here is the lower part of the leaf that surrounds the stem and younger leaves of grass. And then there are pretty much 3 terms that you really should know if you're trying to identify grasses. That's vernation, ligule, and auricles. So vernation is the shape of leaves as they expand from the sheath. This is only specific to monocots. Dicots do not exhibit these behaviors. So they can be rolled or folded. From there, those are the 2 main types. From there, you have the ligule, which is in the collar region. The ligule is a small outgrowth found at the base of the leaf blade on monocots. They are not present in all monocots. And they're generally described as membranous, as you see on the left, hairy, they look like little hairs, and then absent. And when you see a grass weed or a monocot weed, and you can, knowing if it has a ligule or not, and what type of ligule can help you figure out what weed it is. And then from here, the last thing are auricles, which are small projections of tissues found at the base of monocot leaf blades, which surround the sheaths. And they're not present on all monocots, and they're generally described as absent, short, or clasping, also claw-like. And again, that is found in the collar region. So I know that was quite a bit of information, but from here, I'm going to do a brief walkthrough and show you how I would attack identifying weeds in using the Cornell Turfgrass and Landscape Weed ID website. So can everyone see the screen on the left, and you see some plants on the left-hand side and then website on the right-hand side? Good? Okay, great. So if you put in turfweeds.cows.cornell.edu, you will be taken to this webpage, the Cornell Turfgrass and Landscape Weed ID tool. And the first thing you see is an option to choose whether or not it's a grass or grass-like or broadleaf weed. So we're going to go through an exercise of trying to identify these weeds. We'll start with plant A. You see this plant, so based on this plant, we can say that this is a broadleaf weed. Everyone following? So we click broadleaf weed. There we go. And you see all these options come up. So from there, thinking about what you've learned or heard about in the last few minutes, some of the features that are pretty important to see in this weed are that you see that it is an upright plant, so you can hit stature and you can say upright. Okay, now that's narrowed it down to about 60 plants. The leaves, they're heart-shaped, so the leaf shape. Click down there at leaf shape, and you see that they are heart-shaped or spade-shaped, also called cordate. In some manuals, you'll see cordate for speaking about the heart. So now you see there's 4 options, okay? Well, what about the margins? The margins on this plant are they're not fully flat, they're somewhat wavy. So we're gonna click on leaf margin and we see that it's wavy. Oh, look at that, we have 1 option left. So we click on that and we see that this plant, assuming we're all in agreement, is velvet leaf. It's one of my favorite weeds, one of the first weeds I learned. Albutilon theophrasti is the scientific name, and it is in Malvaceae, or the mallow family. The mallow family, they have these characteristic wheel-shaped seed pods. I like to think of them as like cheese wheels that have notches in them. And it is a pollinator attracted plant. So you see, it's not that crazy of a process. So let's move on to plant 2, or plant B rather. So let's go back to the page. So again, we see this is a broadleaf weed. So we're going to click broadleaf. The stature, again, it is upright from the stature. Upright. The margin is toothed, so you see that it sort of looks like a serrated knife. It has teeth, it's dentate. So the leaf margin, we can say it is toothed. Okay, we're narrowing it down. The flower color, you can input that. So you know the flower color is from what it looks like. It looks like the inflorescence color is white. Click on that, it narrows it down even more so. And then you obviously can't touch it right now, but if you look closely at that picture, you can see these hairs all over it. It's a bit fuzzy feeling. And now you have these two options. And based on the picture, I'm going to go with option 1. And from that, we have found, oh, look at that. We have hairy gallinsoga. It's an aster. It's in the Asteraceae in the sunflower family. It is it's not native. It is also not a pollinator attractant. This was a very common weed in vegetable productions. One of the research farms near here in Freeville, this is the main weed that's in the field. Hairy gallinsoga. Fun fact about hairy gallinsoga is that it can reproduce from seed and go through generations very quickly. So I'm in upstate New York. I'm in Ithaca, New York right now, and our seasons are quite a bit shorter than they are down in New York City. And even with our short season, hairy gallinsoga can go through 3, 4, etc. generations in a few months. It's very productive. It can actually start setting seed, even if it's a little jobby. It doesn't even have to be very big. Okay, so the final weed we're going to go through, and oh, look, we have a grass. Oh, it's gotten tough. So we know that it's a monocot. We can all agree about that. It's a grass-like weed. In terms of, let's think about some of the language we learned. In growth habit, it tends to clump. So we see that it's clumping. So we can go on the left side and under stature, and we see that it's a clump. So that narrows it down. Now, the parts that are specific to grass-like weeds and grasses. We have an image on over here of the collar region of this plant. And you can see right here, that thin piece of material, that is the ligule. So if you were in the field and you had a grass, you would pick up the grass and on the collar region, you would pull back. Sometimes with some of them, you can see the ligule sticking out even if you don't pull back that leaf blade. But if you can't, just give it a shot of pulling back that leaf blade. And on this plant, you would see this. So this ligule is hairy? No, it's obviously present. So that just leaves membranous. So under ligule, you see membranous is an option. So that narrows it down even more. And then we see, okay, what about those auricles? So again, you would pull back and you see that there are no auricles present. So under auricles, you would click on that and you hit absent. And that narrows it down even more. Okay, we still have 11 choices to deal with. So what else do you see on this plant? Oh, you see these hairs. It's a hairy plant. So it's under fuzzy. So now we have two options. And what else? How else can we narrow it down? Perhaps vernation. Is it folded or is it rolled? When you look at this, you see you could probably roll it between your hands or roll it between your fingers. So we're going to say it has a rolled vernation. Well, that doesn't help us narrow it down much more. So at this point, I'd recommend clicking on these two images. So let's start with Downey Brome. And I don't have a picture of the inflorescence up here, but if you were looking at it, you see Downey Brome has these panicle inflorescences, and their seed heads are rather large. And I'll just tell you that this plant, when it flowers, does not form these large, draping, quite beautiful actually, inflorescences. So let's go back and choose our other option, large crabgrass. Okay, so we see these hairs. Okay, that looks good. It's clumping. Okay, cool. And then if you did see the inflorescence of this plant, you would see that it looks exactly like this. And what this plant seed is large crabgrass, Digitaria sanguinalis. It is in Poaceae or the grass family. And again, all of these are annual weeds. I believe all of them are actually summer annual weeds. But that is sort of the process that you would go through on not only using this website, but if you had a plant guide and they might have a dichotomous key, you would go through this process. And for you to go through this process, you have to be aware of this terminology. So moving on from there, everyone can see the PowerPoint? Lovely. So from here, we're going to go through some control options. And on the Cornell Turfgrass and Landscape Weed ID website, I'm just going to call it the Cornell Weed ID website from now on because that's quite a mouthful. There is an option you have, you can click to see some chemical control options, i.e. herbicides that are labeled for the said weed, but there's also a tab for pesticide-free management. So the first control category that we're going to speak about today is preventative weed control. So preventative weed control is any method that strives to prevent the introduction and establishment of weeds in a crop area. So that can include many different strategies. That can be if, for example, if you're mulching on an area, making sure if you're using straw mulch, make sure that you're not putting down mulch that is contaminated with weed seeds. So try to go source your mulch from a reputable vendor or ask Was this straw harvested? Let's say you're using rye straw. Was it harvested after the rye went to seed or before the rye went to seed? Because if it's after, it's probably going to have much more rye seed, and you'll probably see rye plants come up in your garden or wherever you're mulching your garden beds or whatever. Another example of preventative weed control is cleaning your equipment before moving from one area to another. So this is something that, like, combines on larger farms, if they have a combine or a cultivator, they'll clean it off before they go to another field to prevent introducing more weed seeds to that area. In a garden setting, that can be cleaning your tools or cleaning your boots out, any of those things. A final on the right hand side is an example of preventative control is if you compost your weeds, making sure that you try not to compost weeds that have already gone to seed, or making sure that it has composted properly so that i.e. the compost has reached adequate temperatures to kill seeds and other reproductive structures in the compost pile. Moving on to cultural control, which is any method that involves altering the growing environment to reduce weed pressure and improve crop competitiveness. So cover cropping, or a great example. On the right side, a lot of people think cover cropping and they think farms, larger farms, but you can cover crop in your garden, in a community garden, on an urban farm. They can be very helpful. They can act as a living mulch, and they can grow thickly among each other. In addition to reducing soil splash and erosion, they also help keep weeds in check by shading them out or not basically crowding them out. And then finally, they can act as a green manure by adding organic matter and nutrients to the soil. Another option is crop rotation all the way on the left-hand side. So that's something that can help weed issues and other pest issues in general. And it's also just a good thing to employ in your garden or your urban farm. So let's say you have a garden bed and last year you grew tomatoes in there. This year grow some kale, or rotate between families rather than individual crops within the family. Something that's pretty relevant for lawns, such as park areas, or if you have a lawn area, overseeding can be helpful in reducing weed pressure. So you see my PI, Jenny Galniffin, she's spreading perennial rye seed along this soccer field in Ithaca and on these bare spots. And in these bare spots that have been trampled down pretty heavily, probably by the goalkeeper, it gives a foothold for weeds to come in, such as like crabgrass is a very common weed in lawns. So by spreading this rye seed, spreading a high amount and doing it repeatedly, it will allow the rye to establish itself and thus crowd out weeds in this area. Next, we will talk about physical/mechanical control, which is any method that limits unwanted plant growth through physical means. So that can be getting down and dirty on your hands and knees and pulling weeds out by hand. Using hand weeding, you see this is some lamb's quarters on this side. That can include using hand tools such as a scuffle hoe. I find this is really helpful, especially if you have smaller weeds and you just want to sort of skim within the first centimeter or half an inch of the soil. This is a soil knife, a hori-hori knife. It's really helpful for digging out those tap roots of dandelions and things of such. Using a regular hoe, using a dandelion cutter to cut the taproot, and then when it sprouts again, you can just keep on cutting it. Also, string trimming works if you're trying to trim along sidewalks or things of such. I will say, if you're going to use a string trimmer, make sure that you use proper technique and follow the appropriate safety protocols. So in terms of technique, pay attention to spin direction, work in direction where clippings are thrown away from the clean area rather than into the clean area. And in terms of safety considerations, understand that string trimmers are one of the most dangerous lawn and landscaping tools. And in order to minimize risk, try to check the ground before trimming so you don't throw debris such as glass, metal, or stones. Wear appropriate PPE or personal protective equipment. So that includes long pants, closed-toed shoes, gloves, eye protection, ear protection. Avoid wearing loosely draped clothing that can be caught in that spinning head. Be aware of your surroundings. If someone's coming near you, maybe stop trimming. And then finally, if you're using a gas-powered trimmer, start it outside and make sure you turn off your engine when refueling. Final thing that I'm going to speak about today in terms of controls is our chemical control options. And understand that chemical controlled herbicides, to be specific, are only one tool in a toolbox. Speaking to this audience, I have a feeling that y'all probably already know that and probably don't use many herbicides at all. But for some weeds, herbicides might be the best option. For example, if you had giant hogweed, you should not try to deal with that yourself. You should actually report it, but they will probably come in and apply herbicides. Wild parsnip, it again is it's planted in Apiaceae, and it can cause photodermatitis. It can cause blisters when the sap gets on you and your skin is exposed to the sunlight. That might be the best dealt with using an herbicide. Poison ivy, another one. And with that, always, if you are going to use an herbicide, always read the label instructions before applying it. Remember, the label is a law. The label on any pesticide is a legal document. And on that label, they will tell you proper application, what weeds are even labeled for this herbicide are labeled for. For example, if you used a herbicide that was not labeled for, let's say, hairy Galansoga, you're technically not using that herbicide properly. Also, some herbicides, they will have, all herbicides on the label will have signal words, and that will help you know whether or not you are even allowed to use this herbicide, because some herbicides are only able to be used or are only legally applied by certified pest applicators. And finally, always wear the proper PPE, which will be written on the label. So, to recap, understanding the biology of a weed is key to effective weed management. If you don't understand the biology, then you can't make as informed weed management decisions. A perfect example is common purslane. Common purslane is a common plant. It's one of the few cam weeds in this area of the country, and it's a very succulent weed. And if you pull it up and just leave it in the field, it has enough water reserves that the sun won't necessarily just dry it up and kill it like many other weeds. Instead, it has enough water reserves where often it can reroot itself. So common purslane is a good plant if you're going to pull it, to remove it from the area rather than leave it. There are several Weed ID resources available to the public, including the Cornell Weed ID website that I showed in the tutorial, but also there's physical references, such as pretty relevant for this part of the country, the Northeast, Weeds of the Northeast. There are other books that are pretty good, that are excellent resources, Weed ID manuals and guides for other parts of the country. I have a list of them in the next slide. And then finally, you want to tailor your management technique choice to the weed at hand. And that doesn't necessarily mean tailor it to the species level, but to those groups of, am I dealing with an annual? Am I dealing with a biennial? Am I dealing with something that spreads? Am I dealing with something that produces rhizomes or tubers? Does it grow earlier in the season, or does it grow later in the season? With that information, you can make better weed management decisions. These are just a list of further resources for weed identification manuals. I spoke about weeds of the Northeast. This is sort of like the weed ID Bible for the northeastern part of the country. It covers all the way from Canada to, I think, Virginia, weeds that are commonly found. If you're in the southeast of the country, Weeds of the South is a great resource. If you're in the Midwest and Canada, Weeds of the Midwestern United States and Central Canada, excellent resource. And also if you're in the western part of the United States, California, New Mexico, et cetera, Weeds of California and other western states is a great resource. So with that, I want to thank you so much. Thank New York City Parks and Green Thumb for allowing me to give this talk today. And thank you, of course, for your time, and open things up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Aleah. This is super helpful and really interesting to learn more about your research and your work and those tools that are so helpful. So I've got a number of questions now coming in on the chat. And folks are reminded, if you have additional questions that come to mind, please put them in the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Let's see, a couple questions I've gotten so far. One was about crop rotation, at the example you shared at the beginning about the soybean plant in the field of corn, or the other way around. Does crop rotation work if there's a few leftovers from the year before?
In terms of, does crop rotation still serve as like a weed management tool, even if there are volunteer plants from the previous year? Is that the question?
I think so, yes.
No. Crop rotation is really useful. Volunteer plants are, especially in garden spaces, tend not to be as much of a problem. If you're growing annuals and they shed their seed by the end of the season, you might have a few volunteer weeds that come up. You can easily just pull them or just let them grow in the space. Crop rotation in general is useful for more than just weed management. It's great for many other things. So definitely go with the crop rotation. I hope that answered the question.
Totally. That's really good to keep in mind, for sure. We got a question about Japanese knotweed and if that's a weed, and is it edible?
I don't know if Japanese knotweed is edible, but it is a weed, and it's very well. It is a weed if you consider it a weed. Most people consider it a weed. It is a pollinator attractant. I believe it's often considered an invasive species. If you're ever driving along in Route 13 or 86 or anywhere in upstate New York, when along highways, you'll see these big sort of like sloped over plants with these giant heart-shaped leaves and red stems. That's Japanese knotweed. In these, sometimes when they're flowering white inflorescences. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's edible. It is a very hardy weed. If you are trying to get rid of Japanese knotweed, it is pretty difficult to do, and it's better done when it's small and the infested areas are limited.
We also got a question about any natural or homemade remedies, weed control solutions that might be best for managing weeds, particularly, I guess, thinking about the scale of gardens.
Yeah. So on the Weed ID website, if you choose a weed, there's control, and if you're using, if you're interested in a spray, there is both, there's conventional herbicides, but then there's also, how do they refer to it on here? Let me just check. Minimum risk, or those are ones that in New York State, they passed the playing fields or playing playgrounds act, where for you to apply herbicides on playing fields or schoolyards, you have to have, it requires an emergency granting, for lack of a better word, from your state or your local government. But there's certain herbicides that are exempted, and those are, I think they're 14 be herbicides. They tend to be OMRI certified. That's the organic herbicide certification herbicides. So some of that includes cinnamon oil, corn gluten meal. Corn gluten meal is quite useful. That's not actually an herbicide. It's literally corn meal that you spread around. Citric acid. What else? Acetic acid is a reduced risk herbicide, so that if you're applying it to a squirrel ground, you would still have to get permission, but it is not like a dicamba or anything like that. So those are some options. There's, yes, someone said in the chat, there's agricultural vinegar. Just know when you use those tend to be, I didn't really get into systemic versus contact herbicides, but I'll just say it here. Systemic herbicides are herbicides that when they're applied, they spread through the system. So like if you have, for example, Canada thistle that has rhizomes and vegetative structures, if you apply it to the top, it will spread throughout the whole plant, as opposed to contact herbicides, which will only affect the areas in which they are in contact. And those minimum risk herbicides they're pretty much all contact herbicides, also called burn down herbicides. So if you have something that's a perennial and that will spread, if you apply that, it won't kill the plant usually in one application. However, you can, assuming it's on the label, always follow the label first. You might be able to do repeated applications. And also, if you have a perennial, you can do cutting, you can mow it back and do continued mowing to exhaust its carbohydrate reserves as it keeps on putting up more and more shoots.
Great, thank you. I also just wanted to remind folks, because folks are coming from all over the country and all over the world, definitely check the regulations of wherever you're based. And also keep in mind that, with different scales of operations, and folks are coming from larger scale farms as well as community gardens. I will also put in the chat a link to the GreenThumb Gardener's Handbook for anyone who's growing on a registered GreenThumb garden, which includes gardens on parks property. So just be sure to check that for the latest of any GreenThumb policies and rules. And let's see, we've got some other questions here. At what time is best to weed when flowering or with seeding weeds?
So you're trying to get rid of weeds, or are you trying to add in plants?
It sounds like when's the best time to intervene if you have weeds that are flowering already? Perfect.
You want to get in there early. You want to do this before it sets seed, ideally, because ideally you want to pull these weeds before they're even flowering. But if you can't get to them, try to do it before they're fully mature and setting seed. Then you don't have the issue, as much of an issue of seed rain adding to your soil seed bank, and then you might have those weeds come up the next year. So ASAP.
Right, definitely. And another question related to timing: can weed seeds be destroyed before the season begins? I guess you spoke to that a bit.
Yeah. So before the season begins, I'm assuming that it's already set seed and they're already on the ground. Assuming you mean that, not really. There is seed predation in soil. So soil organisms such as like rats, or maybe not rats, mice and voles and insects and all those macroorganisms, they do eat seeds. So seed predation definitely has an impact. But in terms of you actually destroying seeds, not really. But what you can do is you can apply, if you're worried about trying to limit the amount that's coming up, you can apply mulches. So you can apply, for example, my family, we have our raised beds in our backyard, and once we're done for the season, we tend to put down like cardboard on there and then weight it down, so to limit the amount of seed being dropped, which there might have been seed dropped in the previous season, but also seed coming in over the season. and then just leaving that alone. So you can do that, or you can plant a cover crop. If you can also just mulch your garden. So let's say you're in a raised bed situation, you can put mulch down, such as straw mulch or paper mulch, like newspapers, or there's many different options for mulch, and have the openings only open for your plants, so that you're limiting the amount of light that reaches the seed and the seeds in the seed bank, and you'll probably have less of a problem weeding, as opposed to just leaving it all open. And then before the plant canopy has filled in, there's going to be much less light interception by your crop, and more light is going to reach the soil surface. And then you probably will have more of a weed problem than if you just put down some straw mulch. If you're using straw mulch or wood chip mulch or whatever, fill in the blank organic mulch, try to source your mulch from vendors, and ask your vendor, like, hey, did the straw go to seed before it was harvested? Or, hey, like, was this mulch heated to kill weed seeds in the mulch? These are questions you can ask to try to limit the amount of weed contamination in your mulch.
Those are all really good points to keep in mind, and it sounds like kind of getting ahead of the growth of weeds is really the important part to keep in mind.
Yeah, prevention. It's like health. My mother works in preventive health, occupational health, and preventive medicine. And just like with people, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure or treatment. With weeds prevention, if you can get in there early and do preventative control options, that is your best option. You will most likely have to get in the field during the season, but if you can do those things early on and like walk around your garden, see things that might be a problem and take care of it, that is great before you have a big problem, because then that will be much more difficult to deal with.
That all makes sense for sure.
Washington, I'm just going to ask you to hold on 1 minute while we get you back on the interpretation line.
Okay. Sorry about that. They didn't tell me.
That's okay. We can continue with the Q&A, and Washington, I'll set you up.
Great, thank you.
1:30, yeah.
And we've got a couple questions about specific weeds or invasives. One is, what's the best way to get rid of poison ivy?
Okay, so for poison ivy, let me think. So you can technically pull poison ivy. If you're going to pull poison ivy, make sure that you are wearing the proper PPE. Wear gloves, wear long sleeve shirt, long sleeve pants, closed-toed shoes. If you come into contact with poison ivy, wash the affected area with soap and water as soon as possible. Try not to touch your eyes with the area that you touch the poison ivy. Whatever you do not burn poison ivy. The smoke produced from poison ivy can cause rashes on your skin, but also on your eyes, in your throat, in your lungs. It's not fun. So you can pull poison ivy, you can cut back poison ivy. You don't really want to mow poison ivy. Don't mow poison ivy. You can also apply herbicides for poison ivy. Like if you have a large infested area of poison ivy, herbicides might be a good way to go. If you're interested in learning more about like plants that might be harmful to human health, on the Cornell Weed ID website, there's a tab called Weeds in Human Health, and weeds on there are the severe 7, and you see poison ivy. There's also giant hogweed, and it has information about identifying it, what to do if you encounter it, and then management. Yep.
And we got a follow-up question about poison ivy, about composting it. I assume not, but you want to...
I'm not sure. I would just not. I can get back to you whether or not it's okay to compost poison ivy, but just to be safe, I wouldn't.
Right. And also have folks keep in mind, for the scale of a garden, anything that you're composting is probably not going to get hot enough to kill weed seeds, etc. but the scale of the municipal compost system is a slightly different story. But good to double check for anything you're not sure of. Be cautious of putting it in your system.
Yeah. One thing about that is also, if you're not sure, I'd reach out to take advantage of GreenThumb. You can also take advantage of Cornell Cooperative Extension. There's extension agents who they are trained in this, and they can answer some of those. They can also answer some of those questions. And if they're not able to, you can also reach out to your land grant university. So for New York, that's Cornell University. For New Jersey, that's Rutgers. If you're in Minnesota, that's University of Minnesota. University of California, Davis, I think, is the land grant for California. You can just look up what your land grant university is, or your extension representative for your respective state. And for states, there might be county extension representatives. So that's county offices, and they will also be able to help you get answers to those questions. And if they aren't sure, then they'll point you, or at least send your question to a person who is well versed in the subject, whether it be a more senior extension associate or a professor at a university.
For sure. So there's a lot of really good resources out there. And as a reminder, we're going to send out an email with all of the links to resources that we've mentioned as well. So you'll have that in your inboxes for everyone who registered. We also got a question about managing bindweed. If you could maybe speak a little bit more to that.
Get it when it's young. Yeah, you wanna pull it when it's young. It's bindweed. Are we talking about hedge or field or just bindweed generally?
I'm not sure for the, it says woods here.
Woods bindweed. I'm not that familiar with woods bindweed. You can apply herbicides, but if that's not what you're trying to do, mechanical management works. You want to get as much of it out as you can, because I think bindweed has vegetative reproducing organs or structures. So you can potentially cultivate. I believe you can mow. It will probably require massive roots. There we go. Yeah. If you mow, you're gonna have to probably mow repeatedly over and over and over again. I actually know a professor at Cornell who deals with bindweed. Some of her projects on bindweed, specifically hedge bindweed. That's Lynn Sosnowski. So it's mainly if you're going the non-chemical route, mowing, hand pulling, cutting back, repeated mowing, those are probably your best bets. But yeah, bindweed's a tough one. Bindweed is can be pretty aggressive.
Great, thank you. Let's see. I also just put in the chat a link to the GreenThumb Growing Food Toolkit, which has a compilation of resources as well, including about composting. So just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. And question about weed control solutions for garden paths and hardscape areas that might have 1 to 2 inch spaces between the path. So best ways to.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely talk about that. Weeding and pavers, between pavers and bricks and all that stuff. Okay, one, if you can using there's a specific type of, it's not grout, I can't remember, but when it comes to me, I'll provide that information. But making sure that if you can re-grout, for lack of a better word, and make sure that is pretty solid, that will help a lot. Regularly sweeping that area to minimize the amount of dirt, of soil that collects in those areas, that will give less of a foothold. What else can you use for those between pavers, those joint areas? Those areas can be sort of tough. You can use a paving knife. So it's this knife that sort of looks like an L, and it has a blade on one side, and it can scrape between those areas. They also have a paving brush that sort of looks like if you've ever used like a barbecue grill and those wire brushes, you can use that to sort of scrub between those areas to knock away little seedlings and moss and soil. All those are helpful. If thermal weeding is allowed in your area, make sure that it's allowed. That is also can be useful. It's particularly useful in hardscape areas because you don't have to worry about a fire risk. Obviously, don't do that near buildings. Yeah, don't do that near buildings, and check with your local fire station and municipality, wherever you are, to make sure that it's legal first. And what else? There, you can probably apply some minimum risk herbicides in reduced risk, like acetic acid. But again, those are more contact herbicides. So you have quite a few options. But in terms of just like, once you get rid of them and you're trying to prevent them from taking hold, a regular sweeping of just sort of keeping it clean, keeping soil from settling in those joint spaces can be very helpful. And if you find that there's large areas where there's like making sure that it's re-grouted or what, there's a specific word for it's a type of sand. Sand for it is, oh yes, polymeric sand. Yeah, polymeric sand is pretty useful for pavers. That's what I was trying to think of. And it's a sand, but it has it's jointing sand, and it has a compound in it that sort of keeps it more so together, and it resists being washed out, like if you pressure washed your area, and it resists like insects penetrating, and it also resists weeds popping up. So if you're gonna re-grout or fill in those joint spaces, I really recommend giving polymeric sand, jointing sand, a look. And then once that's done, sweeping pretty regularly, like using one of those shop brushes that are pretty stiff bristles that you can get in there, or using a joint knife or a weed brush or a paver brush. Those are all pretty helpful for keeping pavers, minimizing the amount of weeds that come up to pavers, and getting them when they're small, as opposed to when they're really large and they have like full-grown tap roots stuck between pavers, like dandelions. That's pretty hard to get out.
For sure. This is all so helpful. You're a wealth of information. Thank you, Aaliyah. I think that's the last question for now, but thank you everyone for all your really good questions and participation. Vanessa, I think over to you.
Great. So I just want to take this opportunity to say a few thank yous and make some announcements about our upcoming sessions. So thank you to our interpreters, Washington and Anna. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today. I know I learned so very much, and I'm sure that you did too. And of course, a very special thank you to Aleah Butler-Jones for this primer on weed identification and management.